Good morning. Welcome to this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and this year by the United States Philatelic Classic Society. I am Scott Tiffany, Librarian and Director of Information Services at the American Philatelic Research Library. Our presenter for this session will be Patricia Kaufmann, and the title for this presentation is Confederate States of America, Postal Innovation During the Civil War. It is now my genuine pleasure to introduce our speaker, Trish Kaufmann. Trish Kaufmann was introduced to Confederate postal history in 1965 and quickly became engrossed in exhibiting, writing, and research on the subject. She served as editor of the Confederate Philatelist, the official publication of the Confederate Stamp Allliance, from 1973 to 1987, and as co-editor prior to that from 1970 to 1973, a total of 17 and a half years, a record number for any editor of the journal. She has served off and on over the years as associate editor to various other editors and has been a contributing editor since 2013, writing in every issue. Trish is past president of the Confederate Stamp Allliance, serving almost 3 years from January 2008 to September 2010, the first and only woman to ever hold that position. She was also the first woman and the youngest person ever bestowed the permanent honorary title of General in the Confederate Stamp Allliance in 1983, and has won the CSA Hayden Meyer Award a record 3 times for service to the Alliance, as well as 3 times winning the August Dietz Award for Research in Writing. In 2016, the St. Louis Stamp Expo, she was presented the prestigious Elizabeth Pope Award for lifetime contributions to philately. In 2017, Trish was inducted into the Philatelic Writers Hall of Fame by the APS Writers Unit number 30. Also in 2017, Trish was honored as the Distinguished Philatelist of the Year at the APS Summer Seminar, as well as receiving the Hellbach Prize for the best article in the 2016 volume of the journal La Posta. The honors continued in 2017 as she was co-winner of the best article in the Confederate Philatelist and also received a large venue in the literature competition at 2017 APS Stamp Show, along with Steve Roth and Frank Crown for co-authoring the work Springfield Facsimiles of Confederate Postage Stamp. Trish was a section editor of the Confederate Stamp Covert Catalog, as well as a contributor to the 1986 New Dietz Confederate Stamps Catalog and annual updates of the Scott Specialized Catalog. She has written hundreds of philatelic research articles, primarily on Confederate postal history, for journals such as the American Philatelist, the Philatelic Congress Books, the Smithsonian Magazine, Waymarkings, the Confederate Philatelist, La Posta, the SPA Journal, among others. Trish was on the CSA Postmaster Provisional Revision Committee, working with publishers of the Scott Catalog to revise this section of the catalogs. She works regularly with the Scott Catalog editors to maintain the Confederate sections of Volume 1 and the Scott Specialized Catalog. It was Trish's definitive research of over 16 years on the 3-cent 1861 Postmaster Provisionals published jointly in both the 1984 and 2000 American Philatelist and Confederate Philatelist that resulted in an entirely new Confederate section in the 2000 Scott Specialized Catalog, as well as the CSA Catalog. Her research ultimately disproved the misconceptions of over a century of prior catalog listing. With more than 50 years of philatelic experience, Trish works as a professional philatelist and holds the premier Confederate retail stock in the country. In 2018, the United States Philatelic Classic Society honored Trish as a distinguished philatelist. With that, here's Trish Kaufmann and her presentation titled Confederate States of America, Postal Innovation During the Civil War.
This is Trish Kaufmann. I'll be speaking to you today about the traumatic period of the American Civil War, which created problems in postal communications between North and South. Predictably, there were postal innovations on both sides born out of necessity. This presentation primarily deals with the Confederate postal system. For the purposes of Confederate postal history, specialized collectors begin with the secession of South Carolina from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Some Confederate postmasters were reluctant to make use of U.S. postage and determined to make their own postage stamps. The Madison, Florida 3-cent 1861 provisional was the first of these. It was discovered by John Walter Scott in 1872. There are 6 recorded, only one of which is used on cover. These were produced before the Confederate Post Office Department was even established. During production of the stamps, gold-colored bronze dust was blown on the wet ink before it was dry, making it a groundbreaking design. Early on, it was dubbed by some as the Golden Stamp of Madison. When the Confederate government was established in early February of 1861, there was no Confederate Post Office Department. It was not established until February 21st, and Postmaster John Reagan of Texas was not appointed until March 6th. Meanwhile, the United States continued to provide postal service in seceded states with U.S. postage rates still in effect. Reagan instructed Southern postmasters to fully cooperate with the U.S. Post Office Department and to remit all monies to Washington. Can you imagine this happening in today's world? In 1861, the U.S. postage rate was 3 cents per half ounce. This was also the Confederate rate until June 1st, when the Confederate Post Office Department took over its own affairs. At that time, the Confederacy instituted a higher rate of 5 cents per half ounce on letters traveling a distance of under 500 miles. This 5-cent rate was doubled for distances more than 500 miles. The rate was 2 cents for local drop covers, circulars, and periodicals. On July 1st of 1862, 13 months later, the rate was raised to a universal rate of 10 cents regardless of distance. This was more than 3 times the U.S. rate. U.S. postal stationery was a valuable source of needed envelopes. Confederate postmasters did not return them to Washington as they should have. Departments of the Confederate government prepared envelopes with their own imprints for official business on these retained pieces of U.S. postal stationery. The Confederate Executive Department cover that's shown here shows that even President Jefferson Davis had to pay postage. The first day cover of the Confederate postal system is shown here. It bears both Confederate and U.S. postage for the first time possible, with both 5-cent and 3-cent rates. The folded letter was written May 29th, but did not reach the post office until June 1st. Consequently, it was hand-stamped with the new Confederate rate of 5 cents. Because Confederate postage stamps were not offered for sale until October 16th of 1861, postmasters reverted to the stampless practices of the 1840s, simply processing mail with hand-stamped or manuscript markings. Small-town postmasters simply wrote the town name, date, and rate on outgoing envelopes. Although adhesives were available in Richmond, the small town of Belfast, Virginia clearly did not have a supply. Postmasters in larger towns and cities often created their own adhesive postage stamps, such as these from Memphis. The provisionals of Petersburg and Pleasant Shade, Virginia clearly share the same design, although not the same postmaster. Note the different postmaster names at the bottom of each stamp. The towns are roughly 50 miles apart. Provisionals came in many variations. Note the Baton Rouge and Greenville, Alabama stamps, which are bicolored. There were no U.S. general issues that were bicolored before or during the war. This was certainly a novelty. Note the second to the left top stamp in the top row. This Gonzales, Texas provisional was simply a label for the bookseller and druggist firm of Coleman and Law. John Law was both the town postmaster and co-owner of the firm. The labels had no value indicated. If you're having trouble making out the text on the stamp at the lower right, It's because it's a mirror image. The design was prepared by hammering printer's type into a wood block, which of course provided a reverse image. This Mount Lebanon, Louisiana provisional is unique. It was used on cover and has long been regarded as the most valuable stamp in Confederate philately. But not all provisionals were adhesive. Some were hand-stamped, and hand-stamped provisionals and stampless uses are easily confused. To qualify as a hand-stamped provisional, envelopes had to be prepared and sold in advance to the public. They were marked with postage rate paid by the patron. Usually there was a control mark that was hand-stamped or signed as a security feature. Customers returned with their addressed mail, and it was then dated with a postmark added at the time of posting. Such services often were advertised in local newspapers, such as the clip at the bottom from the Savannah Republican. At bottom right, you'll see the Savannah, Georgia hand-stamped control marking. Here we have an unused Norfolk, Virginia provisional, and the control marking is the signature of Postmaster A.M. Vaughn, who signed it so he could recognize that the postage had been paid. Patrons were able to bring in regular envelopes, of course, but they also brought in patriotic covers, government envelopes, business imprints or corner cards, and wallpaper or other homemade covers. This is a used Albany, Georgia provisional. The marking is at the bottom left that indicates the 5 cents paid, and the postmark at top right was postmarked the day it was mailed. Other interim hand stamps that are very collectible are the ones that show the problems of transmission across the lines. At the top, you'll see Confederate Dead Letter Office at the far left, and the U.S. Dead Letter Office at the right next to it. Other U.S. markings are mail suspended, sent back to England without a reason for non-delivery, and the popular old stamps not recognized. The Louisville, Kentucky postmaster held accumulating mail that was still being sent north and requested instructions from Washington as to its disposal. Ordinarily, such mail would go to the Dead Letter Office, but the postmaster was told to forward mail post due after he removed the stamps. Thus, Postmaster John Speed created the famous Southern Letter Unpaid hand stamp to facilitate his job. It's one of the most sought after and expensive of Confederate markings. There were 3 printing processes during the 19th century: lithography, typography, also known as letterpress, and intaglio, also known as engraved. Among stamp issuing governments, only the Confederate States employed all 3 to print stamps. Pictured here is one of the hand printing presses used by Richmond stamp printers Boyer and Ludwig. It was a gift to August Dietz, who is known as the father of Confederate philately. It remained in the Dietz family for over a century until it was purchased by Mystic Stamp Company in 2013. It's occasionally on display at major stamp shows. All Confederate general issues were produced imperforate, but there are a number of sheets that were known experimentally perforated in gauge of 12.5. This innovative experiment unfortunately proved impractical, but some perforated stamps were released for use. There were also local post offices that experimented on their own, as shown by the Forsyth, Georgia stamp on the right. As you can see, it has extremely crude rouletted perforation. Per the Confederate Act of Congress enacted July 30th, 1861, soldiers' mail was allowed to be sent free of charge to sender, with the recipient to pay the postage due. The same was true of members of Congress, who were allowed to send mail free to be signed by their official signatures, and the constituents were to pay the postage due. As you might expect, that didn't go over very well with constituents. Can you imagine today if Trump and Biden were sending their mail postage due? I don't think we'd want to be paying for it. So that didn't happen very often, and it's scarcer than you might think. Soldiers were required to endorse their envelopes with their name, rank, and unit, although that was often absent. At the bottom, you'll see that Private Wilson has signed his as proper. One of my favorite areas is covert mail, which is the mail smuggled through the lines and placed into the postal system of the other side. In some cases, smuggled mail was subject to examination by officials such as provost marshals. In most cases, mail was completely covert, thus there are no censor markings. Such mail bears no identifiable markings and can only be identified by letter content or recognized endorsement. May 31st, 1863, a group of expatriate New Orleans citizens in Mobile, Alabama, organized a committee to alleviate the suffering of citizens who remained in New Orleans under Union occupation. They supplied food, medical care, shelter, transportation, and importantly for us, mail service. The Louisiana Relief Committee was not instituted until a year or more after New Orleans was captured by the Union. So consequently, there were other early occupied New Orleans covers that were smuggled out, but bear no trace of indication how they were delivered. This is such an item, and they're rare because they cannot be identified easily. The Chesapeake Bay and Potomac River form a natural boundary between Maryland and Virginia. That is the route that Confederate sympathizers in Baltimore used to communicate with Richmond. That boundary was heavily patrolled by Union gunboats, but there were still many opportunities for clandestine mail exchange. Such mail can only be identified by the content, endorsements, or docketing. The northern neck of Virginia is where the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers meet in the Chesapeake Bay. As with the rest of the tributaries, it was heavily controlled by Union troops, and it changed hands often. This was also an area that the Underground Railroad smuggled slaves across the bay to freedom in the north. Mr. Jenkins charged 25 cents to carry mail to and from Confederate soldiers and their families in the northern neck. Only 2 such covers have recently been discovered, and both contain original letters fully describing Jenkins' express service. You'll see at upper left-hand corner of the cover, paid 25 cents, and at the bottom, politeness of Mr. Jenkins. Correspondence of Henry Bazzi to his wife Annie in Lotsburg. Lotsburg is located in Northumberland County, shown on the map by the arrow. Lancaster County was immediately south. Jenkins carried mail for Company D of the 9th Virginia Cavalry, known as Lancaster Cavalry. J.B. Dutton was an authorized covert mail facilitator. Really the story of 2 towns, north and south, and the man who united them during the war. He was a pacifist Quaker from Waterford, Virginia, who moved to Point of Rocks, Maryland, where he facilitated the movement of the mail. His family remained at Waterford, Virginia to protect family interests. Dutton's 20-year-old nephew was officially appointed postmaster at Point of Rock, but Dutton was also postmaster at Waterford, where his son-in-law acted in his place while Dutton was exiled across the river. Dutton controlled mail on both sides of the river. He did not charge a fee. One of the most unusual things about the Dutton mail is that it was officially sanctioned by Union authority. Dutton hand-stamped his possessed mail with a J.B. Dutton straight line hand stamp, and all mail was addressed to Point of Rocks, Maryland, from the north, and Dutton knew who on the southern side were friend or foe, and he made sure that the mail was smuggled and delivered across the river. Some mail from Confederate prisoners held at Camp Chase near Columbus, Ohio, was smuggled out by Lottie Moon Clark. a Confederate sympathizer, she would carry the mail to Lexington, Kentucky, where she gave it to another covert mail runner for further carriage south to deposit in the Confederate postal system. Stamps are uncanceled since they did not go through the mails. They can be identified by manuscript endorsement, such as at the bottom here, Mrs. C.M. Clark, please forward. She was eventually caught and placed under house arrest, subject to being shot for treason. This cover is from a cache of undelivered letters. Takeover of the mail system in the seceded states by the Confederate Post Office Department caused immediate disruption of mail service between North and South. In response, private express companies began to provide across-the-line service. Under the Confederate Act of March 15, 1861, private express companies were authorized to carry all mailable matter provided Confederate postage was paid. Some companies failed to pay. Reagan requested a change to the law, which reinstated the U.S. PLR as of 1859, as of April 19, 1862. This technically prevented express companies from operating because the Post Office Department did not have the required stamped envelope. In practice, express companies handled mail across the lines only from June 1st to late August 1861. Mail handled within the Confederacy spanned February 4th, 1861 until the end of the war. In October of 1863, the government instituted an official Confederate express service across the Trans-Mississippi River for a rate of 40 cents. East to west express mails outnumber west to east by about 3 to 1. The cover shown here is the earliest recorded east to west. Before that, however, there was briefly a preferred mail service that was approved by President Jefferson Davis April 16th of 1863. But there is no evidence that Postmaster General Reagan took action to implement this service. It was a precursor to the official express service, and very few of such covers exist. There were several private express services such as Cushing's, Edie's, Barksdale's, Bernos, Black, and Sturtevant's, and some covers were also sent courtesy of furloughed soldiers. Congressional acts authorized Postmaster General to arrange for the exchange of mail with foreign governments, but the Union blockade of southern ports and failure of foreign governments to recognize the Confederacy prevented such efforts. There were no formal postal arrangements, but mail continued by blockade runner, express company, or favored by travelers, which was, of course, illegal. I can't help but think about blockade captains. I can't help but think about Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind, who was, of course, a blockade running captain. Blockade runner captains were paid a mere 2 cents per mail piece, and the balance went to pay postal charges. Most outgoing mail was delivered to a forwarding agent at a neutral port who entrusted the captain of a blockade runner to deliver the mail to a foreign port. This particular cover is an inbound blockade run folded letter, which has been forwarded by Saunders and Son of Nassau. It's from Liverpool, England, and addressed to Richmond, Virginia. There was also another way of circumventing the federal blockade, and that was the Rio Grande. Shown here is a folded letter from Victoria, Mexico to Matamoros with the ultimate destination of Brownsville, Texas. It was carried across the Rio Grande to Senor Jose San Roman, who was a prosperous merchant, banker, and broker in contraband cotton. Flag of truce basics include a 2-envelope system with the postage of both sides to be paid or due. The outer envelope was supposed to be discarded at the exchange point, but the rules were not always followed. Not all mail bears censor markings, and Southern prison covers are generally far rarer than Union prison covers and had no hand stamp censor mark. Shown at left is the federal flag of truce boat, New York, at dock at Aiken's Landing, Virginia, awaiting exchange prisoners. The photos from the Library of Congress. Here is a cover that followed the rules. You'll see at upper right the stamp that has been removed before being transmitted across the lines, and a due 10 soldiers due Confederate marking was applied in Richmond. The red examiners and censors markings are at the top. Here's a cover that broke the rules. It's an across the lines prisoners cover from Rock Island Barracks, Illinois to Alabama, and it shows U.S. and Confederate postage affixed on only one envelope, contrary to regulations. The U.S. stamp should have been removed, and there should have been two envelopes. Concealing troop positions from the enemy was crucial. Thus, Army camp markings were usually made up of grids or bullseye targets on outgoing mail. In 1863, the Confederate Post Office Department established official post offices for the two principal armies, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. Evidence also shows that the Army of the Valley had an official post office in 1864, but it is rare and is only recorded with manuscript marking. This is an example of grids and target. They are generally very blurry and hard to identify. They are listed in the CSA Catalog by type. Some Army camp markings were nothing more than anonymous due and rate markings. John L. Eubank was appointed Postmaster of the Army of Northern Virginia in mid-August 1863. He was a former artillery battery commander under General Robert E. Lee. Eubank initially worked with a handful of clerks at Orange Courthouse, Virginia, simultaneously with the town post office. He later moved with the Army, and from summer of 1864 to April of 1865, he operated out of the Richmond Post Office building. Harvey T. Phillips was the former postmaster at Chattanooga and became the unofficial postmaster of the Army of Tennessee on his own initiative. Upon evacuation of Chattanooga in September of 1863, he took the canceling device with him. Military use of this postmark is known as the Chattanooga Rover, Confederate Catalog number ATN-1. It followed the Army as a roving canceling device. The official Army of Tennessee Post Office was formally established December 14, 1863. It used a 3-line typeset hand stamp. There are several variants, but few are as clear as this example. I've often been able to find examples in dealer shoeboxes where they were improperly identified because they were impossible to figure out. The letters became increasingly clogged and worn to the point of illegibility. We have a similar situation with the Warrington, Florida rover. Warrington was captured May 10th of 1862, but as you can see, this cover is dated 19 July of 1862, as indicated by the pencil docketing. Troop clearly took the canceling device with them, just the way Chattanooga did. Adversity covers are one of the most popular of collecting interest in the Confederacy. This quote is from the memoir of Anna Simpson. She says, "A favorite night's employment was found in making envelopes. No bits of white paper suitable for writing with pen and ink could be wasted in envelopes. Thus it happened that wallpaper and sheets with pictures on one side served to make envelopes. These we stuck together with gum from the peach trees." Adversity covers are ones so called because of the adverse effects of the blockade preventing people from getting paper from the industrialized North and from Europe. This envelope is fashioned from an advertising broadside. The more elaborate the design, the higher the price. The most popular of adversity uses is unquestionably wallpaper covers. Envelopes were also sometimes used twice or even more by turning them inside out and reusing the other side. People did what they had to when the blockade of port cut off sources of paper. The 20-cent green stamps are found bisected from a number of Confederate cities. The halves were used for 10-cent stamps. This was illegal, but done out of necessity. Horizontal bisects are far rarer than diagonal. This is certainly an exhibit double threat. It's not only a rare use of a bisected stamp to pay a 10-cent rate, but it's on a wallpaper cover. Closing thoughts. Postmaster General Reagan, the Confederate government, and the military did what they needed to. Reagan initially ensured cooperation with the U.S. Post Office Department early in the war to continue mail delivery to the South. They immediately raised rates, and in 1862, the universal postage rate was more than 3 times the U.S. rate. They used up old stocks of star die in tires for government office use. They instituted special mail routes such as Trans-Mississippi, Trans-Rio Grande, Flag of Truce mail, and blockade run mail. There was a resolution passed so that soldiers could send mail postage due, and Army camp markings with no dates nor places were used in order to conceal military positions. Under these incredible wartime conditions, John Reagan's Confederate Post Office Department made a profit, which was an incredible achievement in wartime conditions. He was even offered a job with the U.S. Post Office Department after the war, but he declined. Confederate postmasters were ingenious. They created their own postage stamps and stamped envelopes, including groundbreaking bicolored and gilt designs. They reverted to antebellum hand stamp markings. They experimented with perforations and roulettes, and they mostly chose to disregard illegal uses by patrons. Private citizens did whatever was necessary. They turned old envelopes inside out and reused them. They used any type of paper with enough blank space. They bisected larger denominations despite being illegal. And they smuggled mail across rivers and bays in the dead of night, out of prisons in hat bands, hoop dresses, and far more. Surely they all had a can-do spirit. Any questions?
Thank you, Trish, for that really very thorough look at this but really unique time in American history and Confederate history. A paid 5 hand stamp from a postmaster in the Confederate stamp in Confederacy is a provisional. How does that differ from U.S. markings of the 1840s and 1850s that read paid 5 or similar that aren't described as provisionals?
So if what I'm hearing is the paid 5, how do you determine whether it's an 1840s marking versus a Civil War marking?
Correct.
I assume that's the question.
Yeah.
One of the things would be an envelope as opposed to a folded letter, which isn't to say that folded letters weren't necessarily Confederate as well. They could be. But there are markings that are used only in the 1840s and markings that were used only during the Civil War. Certainly dates help. Where was the town and what was happening during the war at that time. And of course, the paid 5 marking would only be good until July 1st of 1862. So you have a fairly thin window of opportunity from June 1st of 61 till July 1st of 62 for a paid 5 to be valid.
What percentage of CSA stamps that were produced were actually produced within the CSA?
I don't have a specific percentage, but all were produced within the CSA except for the CSA number 6, Scott CSA number 6, which was produced in England. That was the De La Rue production. They subsequently shipped their plates, their inks, their everything to produce a stamp. They shipped to Richmond via blockade runner, and some went down with the ship, quite literally, and they had to ship them again. And those became the subsequent issue, CSA 7, exactly the same, obviously from the same printing plate, the same look, except that it was darker. And when the paper supply from De La Rue ran out, they reverted to local paper, which is thicker, yellower, and the ink was darker. There's a very easy to tell CSA 6, a very easy to tell CSA 7 if it's a rough and ready look and not a clear, sharp impression as was the De La Rue print. But there is a difficult in between, and those were the ones that were produced with those plates and ink and paper. And those become difficult for even the most experienced person to determine whether it is a Richmond production or a London production.
Someone was interested in your mention of J.B. Dutton. Have you published anything on J.B. Dutton, or if you haven't, is there research out there about him?
There is about to be a lot of research out there on him. I produced, or I purchased my first J.B. Dutton cover in 1979 and have worked off and on research for the last 40 years. I did release enough information to get it listed in the CSA Catalog and in the Walsky Treppel book on Across the Lines mail. But next year will be finally, I hope, and I'm saying it out loud, so maybe it will actually happen, to produce a monograph. Next year it'll be published by La Posta Publications, and the full story will be then. The Dutton covers really started to appear on the market in the 1940s and early 1950s, which was before I was doing anything, and got scattered to the winds. I have managed to record 16 of them now, which is far more than it started out to be, but there could be more out there. The story is a fascinating one. There were 5 Waterford mail carriers that I have actually tracked down. 2 of them were Secesh and 3 were Union, and there was 1 small slave boy who actually delivered mail. They used people like the quote-unquote village idiot who could avoid detection, and he would smuggle mail and hopefully not be caught because they just thought he was out of his mind. So there are lots of very interesting stories, and there is a complete census that will be published within that too. So I hope you'll look out for the publication.
Combining 2 questions here, both involve forgeries. Was counterfeiting of Confederate Postmaster Provisionals an issue? And also, do counterfeits of non-stamped CSA covers, is that an issue?
Let us define counterfeit first. Counterfeit, to me, is something that is done at the time, which is to say a stamp is produced in order to defraud the Confederate Post Office Department. So technically, there are no quote-unquote counterfeits. What there are a lot of is fakes. There are lots of articles, books out there that describe these fakes, and no one should really be caught unaware. buy these things, but they are on eBay and other places all the time. Provisionals indeed are one of the biggest problems, but there are good descriptions of them. Peter Powell and John Kimbrough put out a book on CSA fakes a few years ago, and it has huge pictures, descriptions of exactly what makes them fakes. As I say, no one should really be taken in by these anymore. Things like J.W. Scott, who was, of course, Scott Catalog, unintentionally produced a fake, which is extremely easy to tell by many means, and it's on my website, the description, and many others as well. So there are many, many fakes out there, but as I say, they can be determined.
As unique as these issues are, Confederate issues are what is the rarest stamp that you know of, and are there ones that you know exist but haven't found yet?
The last part of that question is a little, I don't totally understand, but it depends on whether you include provisionals in this. Provisionals overall are rarer than general issues, and that depends, of course, on exactly which one. The frameline general issue is the arguably the rarest, at least the most costly of the CSA general issues, but most, not all, most Confederate provisionals tend to be more expensive, but there are many that are in the $100 range, while it would take you a couple thousand to buy a used frameline off cover.
Are covers from areas overrun by General Sherman scarcer than other areas?
Not really.
The Union counterfeited CSA money. Did they do the same with CSA stamps?
Not to my knowledge. If you're talking at the time, if you count now, yes.
Just read this one. Are there examples of postal communication with Confederate agents in Canada?
Yes, there are. They're rare. You don't see a lot of that, but yes, there are.
Did trains play a significant role in Confederate mail?
They did. The railroad markings are quite scarce. You find them mostly from Virginia, but there are other places, very interesting area, and there have been a number of very good exhibits. They're always very small because you can't get very many frames of railroad cancels from the Confederacy.
I know you've published extensively on this, but what are the 3 or 5 most important reference books on Confederate postal history?
Well, of course, the CSA Catalog, which was published. That would be the current quote-unquote Bible. It is the successor to the Dietz catalogs, so it's a modern, up-to-date, all in full color. I would consider the fake book extremely important. If you're interested in across the lines issues, certainly the Wolski Treppel book is extremely important. The Harrison Prisoners Mail from the American Civil War book is extremely important. The Bine references are extremely important. That's an index of all known articles up to a certain date, and I don't remember now what the date is. It's out of date, and Mr. Bine is no longer with us, so it won't be updated. But that's extremely helpful as well.
Did a large number of CSA post offices close down during the war?
If you're talking at the beginning of the war, probably more so at the beginning, not so much that they closed down as never became a Confederate post office. Those would be the smaller places, of course. And often the smaller places simply, they did have a presence, but it was with manuscript markings and not with hand stamps and not with postage stamps. So you did see them, and that's a very collectible area as well.
Did the CSA ever establish mail service in Kentucky?
Yes. There isn't a ton of it. They are scarcer, but yes, they certainly did. You can find them listed in the CSA catalog, and they are indeed listed.
Are there any CSA postmarkings referencing the CSA Navy?
There are, if you're talking actual postmarks, not per se, but there are Confederate Navy imprints. People who collect CSA Navy do, in fact, collect anything addressed to Captain whoever, Commodore whoever, and most people collect Navy that way.
I think this person's asking if there were particular forgerers. What were the sources of the largest number of CSA stamp forgeries that are still circulating today? The
ones we see most commonly are the Springfield facsimiles. And an entire book has been written on that too, of which I was one of the authors. They are seen every day, and I don't go to a show where I don't see them. There's probably almost not a day that I don't see them offered to me as genuine. And the next will remain nameless, but only yesterday I had a gentleman who offered me his collection of Confederate stamps. Every one of them had a certificate, and at least 3 of the certificates were incorrect. And they were Springfield facsimiles. So that's kind of scary. That particular agency, not the APS, not the CSA, not the PF, I'll leave you to maybe figure it out from there, issued certificates that said they were good, and they were screaming Springfield facsimiles. And if you don't have the book, you better get it.
I had a question myself about covert mail, which I found interesting in your presentation. Were there specific routes that these people traveled, or was this just sort of as, however they got the mail to the next person?
The latter. Mainly they were going across rivers. Rivers and bays were the big one. You saw the one slide on Chesapeake Bay mail, but that when I first acquired the Jenkins Express correspondence, I contacted people in the know in this area, and they said, "Oh, well, you just can't tell. I mean, there really aren't any." Well, there are, but they're extremely difficult to find. But like the woman Lottie Moon Clark, she was smuggling things out. There are probably one of the most famous little teeny weeny items, which is not a cover, but just a tiny, less than a postage stamp size letter that had been folded up and put in a hat band. There was smuggling in all directions, but mostly rivers and bays was the problem. And across the lines, there were soldiers who, were fighting across the lines, and they carried mail. There was a lot of that between Pennsylvania and Virginia, in particular, and Maryland. Those are a heavy area where, say, the Gettysburg soldiers, they came back and were smuggling mail with them.
With that answer, I think we will conclude this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium. For all of those of you joining us for this session, we want to thank you for your attendance and ask that you join us on behalf of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the National Postal Museum, and the United States Philatelic Classic Society, and thanking Trish this morning for this wonderful presentation.